which determine what appears to be the screen out there, and that you don't even know whether there is a screen or what's out there if the veils are too heavy. And the game of all of sadhana is getting rid of those filters, if you will. And the buddhi as a construct, it's a hypothetical construct the way we're using it, as a construct, it's the only part of our nature package that is capable of grasping the higher realms within us, the Atman. And it's called in the Western literature the soul. And in the mystic Christian literature, the statement, when thine eye be single, thy being will be full of light. That is that one we're talking about, the buddhi, when thine eye be single. And while for our discussion it sounds like these are all things or places, I'm not implying that. I'm just using the imagery, because all of that, everything that appears on the screen and all of the processes of looking at the screen, all are projected out from this inner light, from the Atman. Now, the game of yoga, union, is then extricating oneself from the illusion of separateness, extricating yourself from identifying with your ahankara, with your manas, with your lower mind, with all the thoughts that are rushing through, with your sense data, with the sense objects. So instead of me and mine and my thoughts and my feelings and my senses, all this stuff is just stuff. And you are slowly getting free of attachment to this. Remember, karma yoga is non-attached activity. You're getting free of attachment and going back inward towards this Atman, where you will rest in the Atman, rest in the light, the undifferentiated, unconditioned light. And we talked last time about using the intellect as a vehicle to get there, using the mind, and what methods were available for using the mind, which I said was the most powerful siddhi, or power tool that we as biped human beings have at our disposal to get to the Atman. The one unique quality that we have, and we ought to use it. And I did say, however, that it is very trapping, it's very seductive, as all powers are. Every yogic power is a tremendous seduction, because right until the end, when you are merged back into the Atman, you still think you're somebody. And if you think you're somebody that has an incredible power, you tend to get seduced into wanting to use that power. Even in the nice way, like, with this power I can do good, right? And you get into, I'm going to do something about it, right? It's true of all methods. All methods are traps. Everyone. I can't find one that isn't yet. Hopefully, the methods, if they're powerful enough, will take you to the point where you will see the trapping element of them and become free of the trap, including the seer of the trap. Now, the first method I mentioned of using the mind is using the intellect, using in problem solving, and I referred to Oppenheimer's example of anybody that does problem solving with their intellect into a narrow enough and pointed enough and laser beam-like enough use of the mind will go right through. It'll take them through, whether you go through in biogenetics or nuclear physics or what. So that is the use of the intellect, if you will, through logic, just going in and in and in and back and back and back. Then I talked about the use of paradox and the koan in Zen, and how paradox or contradiction generates another level of consciousness. It forces you back in or back up through just facing a paradoxical element in order to bring it to a resolution. Then I talked about injunctives. That is where you accept an instruction that says do this, do that. And a specific example I gave was Ramana Maharshi and the method of Vichara Atma, or who am I? And he gives you instructions. You ask, who am I? And then you say, I am not this. And then you experience that. I am not this. You experience that. I am not this. And it's a set of injunctions. Do this, do this, do this. And it'll take you through if you just follow the instruction. But you need an incredible discipline of mind to be able to follow it. It's a technique of slowly pulling the rug out from under you by following instructions, in which the last instruction, of course, is stop following these instructions. And then the methods of study and contemplation, studying, for example, the Gita, or specifically studying literature that has been written from somebody who is residing comfortably in the place you don't reside, the Atman. That is, it's best to read the words of beings who are it, and I use all these words very gently, like a Christ or a Buddha or a third patriarch of Zen or Tilopa or Krishna in this case. Just taking these words and letting them filter through you by taking them like shloka by shloka and contemplating upon them, working with them, starting to identify, feeling your way into it. It's the way I suggested you read the Gita for the third time. First time you read it as a story, the second time you read it as if you're Arjuna, the third time you read it as if you're Krishna. And then also using the mind is using very analytic techniques of studying your own process of existence and using that analytic process to keep extricating you from the process of itself. And that is what the Abhidhamma is about, which is the Buddhist psychology, which is an exquisite category system. It's like having a desk. Those of you that like working with desks that have little places to put paper clips and rubber bands, and if you have that kind of obsessive compulsive nature, you will absolutely delight in the Abhidhamma, because the Abhidhamma there's not one thing you could think of putting anywhere for which there isn't a place to put it. There are little places underneath and little places around back, and there are secret doors, and it's an incredible desk. And what's good is you can get rid of everything so your desktop is perfectly clean, okay? Which is your mind, or the no mind, or whatever, because there's a place for the concept of the mind. See, that goes there. And it's an exquisite analytic device. And you get so that you work with it so well when you get into something like Satipatthana Vipassana. You get so good at the category system in your mind. You know where every keyhole works, that something appears on your desk, and automatically your hand reaches out and puts it in the right place. And your desk is always clear. And that's using the mind. It's using your mind to beat your mind, if you will. It's like if you have a thought and you think it's my thought, and then you say, oh no, it's actually category 463 sub 2. It tends to depersonalize, tends to take the romance out of it all. The romance out of your personality predicament of I'm really somebody. See? Oh, that one. Well, that one obviously is right? So what we are talking about in this method of wisdom, or in all methods of yoga, is extricating oneself from the attachment to the illusion of a permanent somebody doing something in the world. Getting one free of doing a take of yourself in nature, being attached to the gunas, or the threads that compose the physical plane world. Lovely line by Ramana Maharshi. If it is said that liberation is of three kinds, with form or without form, then let me tell you that the extinction of the three forms of liberation is the only true liberation. That you keep having mind models about where you're going, but ultimately the models themselves have to go too. Because as Ram Tirth said, a God defined is a God confined. Now, if you follow these mind methods through, a number of things happen. One is you begin to sense a deeper way of knowing things, and you start to come into what we've been calling intuition, or an intuitive relation to the universe. And this is very hard for somebody that is used to knowing what they know as objective knowledge to deal with what this intuitive grasp is. It's an inner feeling of, yeah, right, that's the way it is. And my first knowledgeable memory experience of this, where I honored it at all because of its validity and power, was the first time I took psilocybin. When that happened, when I was ripped away from being the knower of objective knowledge and seeing the entire world outside, or from outside, even thinking of myself as an object, when I got into this inner space, the power of it was such that there is a part of me that never returned from that moment. Now, a lot of me did return, and pretty soon that experience, a few days later, as I said about the Zen experience, was a cheap high. It was another memory of something that had happened before. But even though that memory was just weakening, the experience itself had such a powerful sense of validity to it that there wasn't a chance that it was going to be completely lost back into the Akash. And it's as if once this, quote, thing happens to you, once there is the breakthrough, once you have started to experience another way of relating to the universe than the way you have built up the model of how you would relate were you who you think you are, once this thing breaks through, you are literally never the same again, because though you are back in the illusion and you will get sucked into thinking it's real many times, a seed has been planted. The seed has been planted. The awakening has begun. The flip has occurred, and from then on it's merely a cleanup operation. It may take a number of lifetimes, but it's still just a cleanup operation. And in a way, almost by definition, what brings everybody into this room, into Neurotic Institute, is the fact that at some level or other this thing has happened to each being here. It may not have happened by any method you can even label. Or maybe for some of you, because of your particular karma, all the way through your life, you've been flipping in and out of these things, but every time you got into one of these spaces, you labeled yourself as insane. Like I received letters from people in northern Canada. A fellow will say, somebody left your book when they were passing through, and it was the first time I realized I wasn't crazy. Because this stuff's been happening to me all my life. But all the time I thought I was insane. And I never told anybody about any of this. Because it didn't fit in. It wasn't along with the total conspiracy of mind that we call our culture. And once this awareness of another identity in oneself has occurred, then the whole meaning of worldly desires starts to change. It's like you've been collecting baseball cards. You're 12 years old, and you've been collecting or dolls, if you're a girl, if you like a culture-bound thing. But now with women's liberation, we will assume that everybody collects baseball cards and everybody collects dolls, okay? So these are dolls of baseball players, all right? And you've been, to keep everybody cool, and you've been collecting these, all right? And you're doing fine. You've got the best collection around, and you're very upset because somebody else has a doll that you really want, and you're planning and plotting and nights thinking how to, if I give them 3 of this for 1 of that, will they do it? Or if I shovel their walk, maybe they'll give me that, and it's all terribly meaningful to you. And then one day you are sitting or walking or sitting on the bus next to another entity, and there is something that occurs in the vibrational chemistry between the two of you, subtle though it may be, undefined, that makes baseball dolls suddenly irrelevant. Right? Generally called the onset of puberty. Right. And once that has occurred, if you then next day, see, you've been going to a therapist to get over your preoccupation with baseball dolls, all right? Now this thing has happened to you, and the next day you go back to your therapist, and your therapist says, now I realize how terrible a problem this is, and we will work on it, and I have hope that in a year you'll be able to see the light. And you say, the whole thing's irrelevant. And the therapist says, that's a dissociative response. That's because you're so preoccupied with baseball dolls, you don't want to admit it, so you're acting as if it's irrelevant. And you say, no, it's really irrelevant. I've just completely lost my interest in baseball dolls. But see, the analyst is prepubescent. Right? Which puts him in a peculiar position, or her, to keep the whole game straight. Because how is he or she going to know that you are not saying all that as a dissociative process, as a defense mechanism, because you are so preoccupied? You've flipped over the edge now. You couldn't get the baseball doll you wanted, and it was so horrible to you that you went the next level of defense and you said, I don't want the damn baseball doll, right? How does he know it isn't that one, right? He doesn't. Because from his experience, every time somebody says that, when they've wanted it so much, it is that. Right? That's our predicament. You see, that's the one, to he who knows, no explanation is necessary. To he who doesn't, none is possible. And that is exactly the kind of wisdom we're playing with now. We're really talking about a discontinuity of consciousness. You will allow that image. It gets a little weird at the early stages when you start to become discontinuous, because you're flipping back and forth often at a great rate. Because when you're in it, you're really in it, and when you're not in it, whatever it is, you're not either way it is. You're going back and forth, and it's pretty hellish at times. I was once giving a lecture at the Committee on Broadway in San Francisco, and I had taken a lot of acid out at Half Moon Bay in the afternoon. And when I got to the lecture hall, I unfortunately hadn't timed it quite right, and I was peaking. And I stood up on the lecture platform, and I looked out, and all I saw were ocean waves. There weren't any people in the hall. And it was a question and answer lecture, and this thing came up out of the ocean, which, and I acknowledged it, and it stood up, and it was wearing a tie and a jacket and a vest, and it said, would you please comment on the, it was the LSD days, by the way. Would you please comment on the hypothalamus as the significant vehicle in the working of LSD and talk about the synaptic theory of neural interaction? And what I saw, you wouldn't believe. I mean, it was just amazing. It was like this fish that was coming out of the water and saying, do you love me? So I answered as best I could, and I said, I love you. To which the fish replied, that answer is not satisfactory. At which point I started to what is known as bad trip. Figuring I better get down quick. And I then spent 15 minutes trying to answer his question with sweat pouring out of my... Now, what is this other domain or focus of energy or non-domain or whatever it is, or isn't, that one enters or doesn't enter into? You see the predicament now. I mean, I'm sure you're aware of it, that it's easy to talk about it from this end there, assuming this is this. It's very different to talk about it from there, this, see, because it can't be said and it can't be whistled either. See? So, the predicament is we are going to talk about the unspeakable, which is the Brahman, which is that light inside, which is the one of the universe, which is the ultimate illusion, which is, look, these are all little places we're saying it from here. Right? And as I've suggested, once you have touched or tasted or sensed or intuited or everything turns out to be different. And at first, you're completely hooked on one plane of reality, but the minute you've flipped your television receiver dial and you realize that although there's only advertisements on this station, on this other station, which you didn't even know existed, there is the most incredible programming. Then the question is how quickly, how much you want to come back to the old program again. And there is a very beautiful devotional text about the Gita by Janeshwar, which is put out by George Allen and Unwin. It's very lush, and from now on, again, I'd like to read you little parts of it. As a high mountain cannot be washed away by a flood which is a mirage, so he who is not affected by weal or woe. Once you start to enter into this other channel, baseball dolls don't get to you. Is it any wonder that one who does not wish to forego the bliss quality, we'll keep talking about qualities, but remember, they've all got to be let go of. They're just, from this end, we're talking about them, qualities. Is it any wonder that one who does not wish to go the bliss of the self in order to return to the domination of the senses takes no pleasures any longer in objects of sense? Enjoying to the full the bliss of the self once his heart is established in it, he will never leave it. Will the chikora bird feeds on moonbeams. Will the chikora bird lick the sand when it's among the bed of lotus flowers and it has once fed on the clear beams of the moon? Now, thy curiosity will certainly prompt thee to think, who then are deluded? Who's still stuck? Who's busy collecting baseball dolls? They indeed who do not know themselves. They don't know what the real scene is about. They haven't the sort of discrimination to discriminate the, quote, real, which is always with a capital R, from the unreal, with a small u. They indulge in the pleasures of sense as a hungry man will eat husks, or as a deer afflicted with thirst and in its distraction forgetting to look for water will rush to a mirage in the desert. I mean, once you've been in this place, will shade of clouds afford protection against the wind, rain, and heat when you have a beautiful house to live in? Would a serpent's hood be cool enough for a mouse? I'm just going to start to introduce you to the, O son of Pandu, as the piece of bait, that's the desire out there, attached to a hook is good so long as it is not eaten by the fish. So it is with all contact with sense objects. That is, once this thing is started, you see sense objects in an entirely different way. Because if you've tasted, it's like you go out and you buy a new Mercedes-Benz, and then you're getting the rush off driving your new Mercedes-Benz. Or whatever your trip is, you cook a bouillabaisse, and you get the first bite of bouillabaisse, and is it good? Or you are involved in an exquisite sexual dance, and you come to the timeless period, the timeless moment of foreplay. Now, as long as those are the ways in which you come to, let's say that of all those things, there is some communality about them, that they all touch a moment where you feel fulfilled. Yeah, right. You're working from a place of peace. I mean, usually when you're in the midst of making love, you don't want a root beer. Okay? Or if you're a root beer freak, when you're drinking the root beer, you may not want to be making love. Because when you're getting what it is, as you're driving the Mercedes, whatever it is, there is that moment of enoughness. Instead of more is better, suddenly enough is enough. And right here, and it's enough. Yeah. Now, it's the root beer is going to turn warm, or it's going to go dead, or it's going to, you're going to finish it. And everything else out there is in time, and it's going to pass. So what you do is you get very hooked on manipulating your objects. You get a little of this, a little of that, and then you'll finish with this and try that. And after the root beer, we'll have the pizza, and then we'll go to bed, and then after we go to bed, we'll have a cigarette, and then we'll go to sleep. We'll get up and we'll have that morning coffee, and then we'll sit in the sun, and then we'll read that book, and then, and on and on and on. And it's just a little bit, because we're getting to be masters of controlling the environment, because we think the game is man over nature, man over the collection of baseball dolls, in order to optimize that moment. Now what happens is, by some weird concatenation of events, you suddenly find that that moment turns out to be residing right where you are when you stop freaking so bad. And it turns out you are that moment. And that all of these little things were like, you get a dollop of bliss for that, and a dollop and a half of bliss for that, and a half a dollop of bliss for that. How about if you can have the whole bag? We give our cat a handful of cat food, but we put the cat food in a bag under the sink, and during the night the cat opens the sink door and goes in and eats all the cat food at once. Then in the morning it meows like it hasn't had any cat food. It took us weeks to figure out how the cat was getting so fat. Because once you know where the cat food is, see, the whole trip is different. Okay? The anxiety starts to dissipate a little bit. I mean, You're not worried that if you get to the refrigerator, the root beer will all be gone, because it would be okay. This evening we're going to discuss three concepts that are very dominant in the Bhagavad Gita. The concepts are Brahman. We're going to introduce the idea of the Purushottama. And we're going to also, if time allows, discuss sacrifice and the way sacrifice works. Now I'm going to read to you not only shlokas from the Gita, but quotes from other beings, some of the poetic version of the Bhagavad Gita written by Ganeshwar, some of Ramakrishna's experiences about the Brahman. If you are aware of the predicament that, as Ramakrishna says, the one thing that can't be soiled by man's tongue, by words, is the Brahman, because it really can't be spoken about. We can talk about it, but we're talking from one place about something in another place that is entirely different than anything that is speakable about, so that there is a certain way in which we are at the point where language is denotative. We're just pointing to the place. The language isn't a substitute for the thing itself. It's merely pointing there. And so if you just open yourself to these different kinds of writings, you will start to get a feeling for what Brahman is about. There are two kinds of Brahman referred to in the Gita. One of them is the formless aspect, and the other is that aspect which creates form. And we are talking now about the formless aspect of the Brahman. It's as if when we went through the sequence before, and this is all still part of what's called the higher wisdom, or becoming the man of vision. When we went through the sequence before, the feeling was, the understanding was, that as we extricated ourselves from identifying with body, with personality, with senses, and even with thought, and pulled back in and in and in, we came to the point within us which we call the Atman, which was the spirit within the form. And that Atman is like the doorway through, or that part of Brahman which is in each individual. And one of the routes through to the Brahman is therefore going back inwards, as Ramana Maharshi does with the neti, not that, pulling back in. And as you'll see later, another way is to go out. There are many ways to get to Brahman. One of the statements made in the Tao Te Ching, which I think most of you must be familiar with, the Book of Tao, it's apocryphal. I doubt if it's the way it is, but it's as good a way as any, that the keeper of the library, Peking, was going home to die. He's a very old man, and he came to the boundary between his home province and the place he was leaving. And the guards stopped him and they said, "You have to pay a fee to cross this boundary." And he said, "I don't have anything." And they said, "Well, what did you do in life?" He said, "Well, I was the librarian." And they said, "Well, you go over and sit under that tree and you write down everything you learned and leave that with us." So he did go over and he sat down and he wrote these 81 verses. And this one is verse number 14. "They call it elusive and say that one looks, but it never appears. They say that indeed it is rare, since one listens, but never a sound. Subtle, they call it, and say that one grasps it, but never gets hold. These three complaints amount to only one, which is beyond all resolution. At rising, it does not illumine. At setting, no darkness ensues. It stretches far back to that nameless estate which existed before the creation. Describe it as form, yet unformed, a shape that is still without shape. One meets it and it has no front. One follows and there is no rear. If you hold fast to that most ancient way, you may govern today. Call truly that knowledge of primal beginnings a clue to the way. From our Gita. When a man surrenders all desires that come to the heart, and by the grace of God finds the joy of God, then his soul has found peace. He whose mind is untroubled by sorrows, and for pleasures he has no longings, beyond passion and fear and anger, he is the sage of unwavering mind, who everywhere is free from all ties, who neither rejoices nor sorrows if fortune is good or is ill. His is a serene wisdom. When in recollection he withdraws all his senses from the attractions of the pleasures of sense, even as a tortoise withdraws all its limbs, then his is a serene wisdom. Even as all waters flow into the ocean, but the ocean never overflows, even so the sage feels desires, but he is ever one in his infinite peace. This is the eternal in man, O Arjuna. Reaching him, all delusion is gone. Even in the last hour of his life upon earth, man can reach the nirvana of Brahman. Man can find peace in the peace of his God. The man who sees Brahman abides in Brahman. His reason is steady, gone is his delusion. When pleasure comes, he is not shaken, and when pain comes, he trembles not. He is not bound by things without, and within he finds inner gladness. His soul is one in Brahman, and he attains everlasting joy. For the pleasures that come from the world bear in them sorrows to come. They come and they go, they are transient. Not in them do the wise find joy. He has inner joy. He has inner gladness. He has found inner light. This yogi attains the nirvana of Brahman. Holy men reach the nirvana of Brahman. Their sins are no more, their doubts are gone, their soul is in harmony, their joy is in the good of all. Because the peace of God is with them whose mind and soul are in harmony, who are free from desire and wrath, who know their own soul. When the sage of silence, the Muni, closes the doors of his soul, and resting his inner gaze between the eyebrows, keeps peaceful and even the ebbing and flowing of breath, and with life and mind and reason in harmony, and with desire and fear and wrath gone, keeps silent his soul before final freedom. He in truth has attained final freedom. And finally, the group of shlokas in the 13th chapter. Now I shall tell thee of the end of wisdom. When a man knows this, he goes beyond death. It is Brahman, beginningless, supreme, beyond what is and beyond what is not. His hands and feet are everywhere. He has hands and mouths everywhere. He sees all, he hears all, he is in all, and he is. The light of consciousness comes to him through infinite powers of perception, and yet he is above all these powers. He is beyond all, and yet he supports all. He is beyond the world of matter. He is invisible. He cannot be seen. He is far and he is near. He moves and he moves not. He is within all and he is outside all. He is one in all, but it seems as if he were many. He supports all beings. From him comes destruction, and from him comes creation. He is the light of all lights, which shines beyond all darkness. It is vision, the end of vision, to be reached by vision, dwelling in the heart of all. In Hinduism, the expression that is used is chitta vritti naroda. Chitta vritti naroda. The cessation of the turnings of the mind. The image is of an ocean on which there are waves, and the waves are thought forms, feelings, personality, worldly sense data, thought forms, ripples on the waves. And slowly these ripples get quieter and quieter until there is a vast, calm ocean out of which these ripples came and back into which they return. And that image is the image of Brahman. Now the predicament of Brahman is that it looks one way from where we're looking at it from our thoughts, and it's quite another to be within it. There's a beautiful story. Ramakrishna used to go into samadhi all the time, into very high states of samadhi. And he always wanted to share with his disciples what he was experiencing. So he'd say, well, now, when Shakti, when the Kundalini comes up and it gets to the third chakra, you experience this, and he described that. So when it gets to the fourth chakra, the Anahata, you experience this. When you get to the fifth chakra, he'd say you experience this. And when you get to and he'd go into samadhi. And he'd just be luminous and stand there and be, somewhere else, right? And he would be differing from a dead man only in that he retained his physical life heat and the senses were available. Then he'd come down and he'd start again, and he'd say, it gets to the third and the fourth, and he'd go fifth, he'd go out again. And after 3 or 4 times, tears were streaming down his cheeks. And he said, I really want to tell you, but the Divine Mother won't let me. I just can't do it. It just won't come out. It just can't be expressed. From here, all of the statements that concern the entering into, quote, nirvana or nibbana are relevant to the entrance into the Brahmanic state. The blowing out of the candle. From this point of view, everything that you and I know as who we are falls away from our minds completely. And as long as there is stuff in you that pulls you into this world, desires, attachments, even attachment to knowing anything, then this state is elusive. You may be able to work with energy and to overload so that you get into a lower level of this experience where you get a sensation of what it might be like. But then, as the wedding guest in the Bible, you get cast out again because you're not wearing the spotless wedding garment of no attachment. In a way, the validity for me of what this is all about has come through my psychedelic experiences, which I recognize as possibly only an astral analog of the real thing. But I can vividly recall back in 1962, 63, in a meditation room in our house in Newton, where Tim and I were living, taking LSD, and for 3 or 4 hours by clock later, there was no universe. There was no experience of no universe, and yet it wasn't empty. These are all paradoxes. And imagery I have, unfortunately, is that as the chemical overload wore off and my karmic predicament reasserted itself, rolling down the room was this huge red, blood-red wave which had in it all of me, little me, all of the images of who I was, and it was like a Hieronymus Bosch painting. It was a yich. And I remember putting up my hands to ward off the re-entry, if you will, but I knew no secret mantra, or no way to stop the wave, and it rolled in over me, and I could feel coming back into form. And before that, there had been just this peace in every direction and this feeling of the oneness of the universe. But even those words are not descriptive. They're just qualities that I'll talk to you about how they fall short. The meditation room we had was we had put a false wall in the living room, so it appeared the room didn't exist, and you had to come in through the basement, up through a ladder. And it was sort of in the middle of the house, and I climbed down the ladder when I finally got back into my body. And I went upstairs into the kitchen, and there was a woman who had just arrived at the house the day before, and she had come up from the south on a bus in order to get a job in the north. It's very far out. And she had come to our house, and she was going to work at the house, and apparently she was sitting in the kitchen drinking a cup of coffee, and I came up from the basement, and she took one look at me, and whatever it was she saw blew her mind, because the coffee cup went flying, and she came running off. This was about a 55-year-old woman, very solid, straight, conservative Protestant. Came over and she fell at my feet, grabbing my feet and kissing them, which completely freaked me, as you can well imagine, and drove me running out of the room. Later she said, when she came up, all she saw was golden light. So whatever that Brahmic state was about, it was coming through. It wasn't me, it was just I was being used in a way to blow her mind, the way I understood it. In describing the Nirvikalpa Samadhi of Ramakrishna, in that rapturous ecstasy, the senses and mind stopped their functions. The body became motionless as a corpse. The universe rolled away from his vision. Even space itself melted away. Everything was reduced to ideas which floated like shadows in the dim background of the mind. Only the faint consciousness of I, repeated itself in dull monotony. Presently that too stopped, and what remained was existence alone. The soul lost itself in the self, and all ideas of duality of subject and object was effaced. Limitations were gone, and finite space was one with infinite space, beyond speech, beyond experience, beyond thought. Sri Ramakrishna had become the Brahman. And Ramakrishna said, our attempt to go to Brahman to report back what it's like is like a salt doll, a doll made of salt, that goes to the bottom of the ocean to determine its depth, because obviously on the way it will become totally dissolved, and so there will be nobody to report back. And that was Ramakrishna's predicament. Now, for our purposes, although it would be nice to continue the tennis match, for our purposes, when we are considering Brahman, it makes little difference to us whether we approach it from a Buddhist or Hindu point of view at this stage. That is, we are aiming towards shunyata. We are aiming to extricate ourselves from the attachments to our thought forms. And that oceanic concept of Brahman, which in the Upanishads they say, an ocean one, the seer becomes without duality. This is the highest path, the highest prize, the highest world, the highest bliss. It is that bliss of his on but a fraction of which other beings live. And in a Buddhist text describing the Buddha, it says, freed from form, sense perception, feeling, habitual tendencies, and consciousness, he is deep, incommensurable, unfathomable, like the great ocean. And since any label of Brahman is wrong, any attribution of any form is wrong, even to the concept of void or empty. In that sense, it is gone, 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 gone beyond, completely gone beyond the concept of beyond. And here again is the third Chinese patriarch to again show another facet of the Brahman. Because you can come at this through Southern Buddhism, you can come at it through Tibetan Buddhism, you can come at it through Chinese Zen, through Japanese Zen, through Hinduism. It is where the transformation has occurred. And all we can do is point at it or become it. For the unified mind in accord with the way, all self-centered striving ceases. Doubts and irresolution vanish, and life in true faith is possible. With a single stroke, we are freed from bondage. Nothing clings to us, and we hold to nothing. All is empty, clear, self-illuminating, with no exertion of the mind's power. You don't have to do anything to see it. Here, thought, feeling, knowledge, and imagination are of no value. All the things you did to get there are meaningless once you're there, or here, or not there, or here. In this world of suchness, there is neither self nor other than self. To come directly into harmony with this reality, just say when doubts arise, not two. In this not two, nothing is separate. Nothing is excluded, no matter when or where. Enlightenment means entering this truth, and this truth is beyond extension or diminution in time or space. In it, a single thought is 10,000 years. Emptiness here, emptiness there, but the infinite universe stands always before your eyes. Infinitely large, infinitely small. No difference, for definitions have vanished and no boundaries are seen. So too with being and non-being. Don't waste time in doubts and arguments that have nothing to do with this. One thing, all things move among and intermingle without distinction. To live in this realization is to be without anxiety about non-perfection. To live in this faith is the road to non-duality. Non-duality is one with the trusting mind. Words. The way is beyond language, for in it there is no yesterday, no tomorrow, no today. One of the qualities of the Brahman is the quality of omniscience. The way I've worked with the concept of the Brahman, just conceptually, on a physics level, is to assume that as you go into smaller and smaller units of energy, what seems like the air, or seems like Mars, or seems like this carpet, all turn into tiny units of energy. We're doing a metaphor now, and it's risky because it implies entityness, but we'll work with it. And you get down to these tiniest somethings of energy, which, as you remember in the Oppenheimer quote, you can't say that they're either this or that, but there is some patterning or something of energy. And everything in the universe is made up of the same stuff. And it's all interchangeable at every moment. And it's all totally interrelated. It's like a solid mass, if you will. Although that sounds very entityness. Careful. Just use it as an analogy. but it has a one solid quality about it. And when you are not attached to being a separate part of it, you are part of it all, and at that part, all is known to you subjectively, and you are everywhere at once, because you are no longer in a time-space fix. Everything that I have experienced in any of my inner work, and everything that I have understood from my gurus continually saying to me, sub-ek, it's all one, sub-ek. Don't you see it's all one, Ramdas? And all of my studies of the literature have reinforced and supported this feeling of the interrelatedness and the omniscience and omnipotence and integrity of that which lies behind form. And it's interesting that in reading Cutting Through Spiritual Materialism, there is hardly one thing in this book that I disagree with. It all feels right on to me. In fact, it feels right on in one of the clearest exegesis I've ever read. But there is one question. Question is an enlightened person omniscient? And Trungpa answered, I am afraid this is a mistaken conclusion drawn from the Yogacaran one-mind theory, a theory which has also appeared in other religious and philosophical traditions. The idea is that an enlightened person has become the one mind and so knows everything that ever was, is, or could be. You always get this kind of wild speculation when people involve themselves with mystery, the unknowable. But I am afraid there is really no such thing as the one mind. I thought you'd enjoy that. In the Prajnaparamita Sutra, all Buddhas of past and present, Buddhas of future time, using this prajna wisdom, come to full and perfect vision. Now, just in case it all seems too Eastern in flavor, let me just read you a few quotes from Franklin Merrill Wolff. He is an interesting American scientist type. I was first turned on to him by a lawyer in Washington, and then I found out that he was a very close associate of John Lilly's when I was visiting John. And he lives up in Lone Star, California, in a little cabin with his wife. He's about 80 now. And these experiences happened to him in 1937. The event came after retiring. He had been doing a lot of meditation. I became aware of a deepening effect in consciousness that presently acquired or manifested a dominant emotional quality. It was a state of utter satisfaction. But here there enters a strange and almost weird feature. Language, considered as standing in a representative relationship to something other than the terms of the language, cease to have any validity at this level of consciousness. In a sense, the words and that which they mean are interblended in a kind of identity. The relative theories just didn't apply at this level. So satisfaction and, quote, the state of satisfaction possess a substantial and largely inexpressible quality. This state of satisfaction was a kind of integration of all previous values, the culminating fulfillment of desires. One can desire only when there is some sense of lack or an incompleteness, what needs to be fulfilled, or a goal that needs to be attained. When in every conceivable or felt sense all is attained, desire simply has to drop out. The result is profound balance in consciousness. Gradually the satisfaction faded into the background and by insensible gradation became transformed into a state of indifference. While within this state, I recalled the basis of my previous motivations and realized that if this state had been outlined to me then as an abstract idea, it would not have seemed very attractive. But while fused with the state, all other states that could formerly have been objects of desire seemed flaccid by comparison. The highest conceivable human aspiration envisages a goal inevitably marred by the effects of immature imagination. As an intimate part of that supernal consciousness, there is a sense of power and authority, literally of cosmic proportions. I got a sense of that one day when I was sitting with my guru, and Indira Gandhi went by with her generals and jeeps and the whole business. We knew she was in town and going around. And Maharaji said to me, It's just this old man sitting on a wooden table with a blanket wrapped around him. Look at all that. And it's just a worldly king. Can you imagine all that? And it's only that much power? I mean, it isn't even the real thing. It isn't even the real power. By contrast, the marchings of the Caesars and the conquests of science are but the games of children, says Merrill Wolfe. For these achievements, which seem so portentous and commanding upon the pages of human history, all inhere in a field of consciousness that in its very roots is subject to that higher power and authority. I found myself spreading everywhere and identical with a kind of space that embraced not merely the visible forms and worlds, but all modes and qualities of consciousness as well. However, all these are not there as disparate and objective existences. They are blended, as it were, in a sort of primordial and culminating totality. He said, the secular universe vanished, and in its place there remained none other than the living and all-enveloping presence of divinity itself. Merrill Wolfe, Philosophy of Consciousness Without an Object, it's called. Now, lest all of you feel this is all just too abstract and irrelevant to your life, let me say that the only way that any of those bones will take on flesh is through your own experiences. It will never be gratifying just to hear about it. But what the hearing about it may do when you open to it is resonate within you in a place where you sense the validity of your identity with something other than what you, quote, think you are. And that sense is what gives one, quote, faith to undertake all of the methods of yoga, to fight the battle of Kurukshetra. It's right at that place that the faith is generated. It's an incredible panoramic view of all form, both physical plane, astral, causal, all the conceptual, all levels of form, even way back to the pure idea. All of it folds back into that which is unnameable, unknowable, unimmeasurable, indefinable, and yet is. You will have many experiences. Some of them will only be like the experience of emptiness. That isn't it, because no place is it. No experience is it. But it is the presence of all paradox, of all polarities, of all opposites. At that point, time has stopped. Past, present, and future all are right here. All are right here. So there is freedom from time and space. And that kind of freedom is reflected, for example, in Kabir saying, I shall not come and I shall not go. I shall drink nectar with my guru. One turns a tasbih, another turns a mala. But see, O people, they're both professionals. One goes to Mecca, one goes to Kashi. But both have nooses around their necks. Listen, O people, Kabir says, I am of no one is mine. Now we're talking about freedom. We're really starting to talk about what the freedom is of this journey. The freedom from models, the freedom from standing anywhere, the freedom from limited view, the freedom from limited sensation. I am in the world, but I am not a subordinate of the world. That means you have transcended the gunas, the forces of nature, the strands of rope that create nature. I have passed through the market. I am not a purchaser. I have passed through the market. I am not a purchaser. Nothing does it to me anymore. Were the Gita to stop at this point, I think that the Buddhist influence on the Gita would be the dominant theme of the Gita. And what we've done is now seen the higher wisdom that is expressed up through chapter 6, roughly. But the Gita suggests a whole other type of wisdom. See, there is a predicament that the Buddhists talk about in terms of the bodhisattva. And the predicament is that everybody, you'd figure if you went back into the Brahman and merged totally into it, would there be anything doing? Would anything ever be done? Would there be any form? Would there be any manifestation? Would there be any avatars? Would there be any bodhisattvas? What would they do? Where would the law be? Isn't the law under this state? And if it's under this state and you've transcended all law, why would you do dharmic things anymore? Why would it keep saying that beings who rest in the Brahman become the Dharma itself with a capital D, not a little d? Who are these beings that roam around free, yet apparently continuing to manifest? What Krishna says to Arjuna is, until you're quieted down, until your mind is completely cooled out, until your purification exercises are all over, until you are residing in the Brahman, you won't even begin to recognize me. And what Krishna is suggesting is that beyond both that which is without form and that which is form, behind both Purush and Prakriti, behind the Brahman and the Shakti, there is still some other There is still the Dharma. There is still law. There is a directionality